Did Mr. Bovet have his camera on when he did these? He did. Okay. All right. Well, I will follow in that tradition then, but I will be drinking some water though. I hope that's not too distracting.
No, not at all.
Hi, Susan.
Hi. Hi, everyone.
Hi,
Hey,
Susan. I've heard that Commissioners Milliman and Wellner will not be attending today.
Yes, that's correct.
And then Chair Lockwood, I don't remember, I think we talked about this yesterday, but we do have a guest speaker, Andre Tremblay, who will give
Yes.
yeah, okay. So I'll introduce her when we get to that item.
Yeah, welcome.
Thank you for the invitation. Glad to be here.
And we officially have quorum.
Okay, I'm not seeing everyone. So we have, okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Deborah Lockwood, Chair of the Washington County Planning Commission. Today is May 4th, 2022, and today's meeting of the Planning Commission is called to order. May we have the roll call, please?
Yes. Commissioner Bidu,
Present.
Commissioner Havner,
Present.
and Commissioner Milliman is absent. Commissioner Petrillo,
Present.
Commissioner Podar. Doesn't look like she's with us right now, and I haven't heard from her that she was going to be absent. Commissioner Wellner is absent. Commissioner Will,
Present.
Vice Chair Dye. Looks like he's not on as well, and I didn't hear from him. And Chair Lockwood.
Present.
So it looks like we have 5 that are present, which, as Todd said, we have a quorum.
Very good. Thank you.
Mhm.
Our first item today is our director's report. Mr. Back, would you go ahead?
We'll go ahead. So back on April 18th, the board met on the middle housing ordinances on 885, which you'll recall was the one that you had numerous hearings on. They showed initial support for your changes. They're going to meet again on May 17th to direct specific engrossment on those changes, because we didn't have all of the T's crossed and I's dotted for them to act at their previous meeting, but they'll act on the official language on the 17th. But that includes your recommendations regarding detached plexes and removing the sidewalks and removing the garage design standards. They also ordered engrossment on 886, and that hearing will be on May 24th. On the 3rd of May, the board continued Ordinance 883. That's the extension of Cornelius Pass Road. So it's still a little bit up in the air in terms of what they're going to do on that. And they continued that till October 18th and directed us to do some more analysis and do some more public engagement. Today you'll have 2 work session topics. One is on manufactured housing, and the other is to give you an update of the activities surrounding the remand of Bay and Gross 869, which is the significant natural resources work that you've been involved with previously. Right now, we don't have anything scheduled for your May 18th meeting, so we're recommending that you cancel that. We don't have specific agenda topics for your first meeting in June, but we think we'll have some work session topics by the time that rolls around. So with that, I conclude my presentation.
Yeah, thank you. Are there questions for Mr. Back or comments about what he has brought up? Ms. Cherniak, I saw your hand first, and then Commissioner Petrillo.
I just wanted to mention that Mr. Bovet is on vacation at this time, and so we are graced by the presence of Jacqueline Sato as County Counsel today.
Yeah, thank you. And welcome, Ms. Sato.
Thank you, everyone.
Mr. Beck, the Cornelius Pass extension, were public hearings held on that?
Public hearings were held this last hearing. They didn't have any testimony, but previous, they certainly heard from the community and at least the Riggs Road folks not being very pleased with it. So,
okay, that's it. Thank you. Okay, I got to let him out.
I was going to say, do we have another planning commissioner that I don't know about?
Who's already had enough of this.
Very, very vocal.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any more hands up, so I think we can progress to oral communications. I believe we have at least one person signed up to give testimony today.
Yes, that's correct. Chair Lockwood. We have Pat. Is it Weber? Hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Weber.
Thank you.
Mr. Weaver, would you state your name and address, and then please go ahead. You have up to 5 minutes.
Well, I won't take anywhere near that amount of time. Pat Weber. I'm on 13485 Northwest Northrop Street, Portland 97229, in the Cedar Mill area.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, I'm a fairly new member of a group called Tree Keepers Washington County, and I have been watching a lot of development, and this is my first testimony, so bear with me if I'm try not to ramble too much.
Right.
But basically, where I'm going is I'm taking an example of the apartment or condo complex on TV Highway and Murray Road, the new huge buildings there. And I'm just wondering what county regulations there are for preserving green space, because I don't see a lot of green space in that area there. And there have been some concerns about recent development on Salzman Road, which eliminated a bunch of older growth trees on the Bauer property. And apparently the developer didn't have anything stating he couldn't do that. So I'm just wondering what the policy, and I've heard about significant natural resources of new development, and especially when I think about manufactured homes in light of the 116-degree temperatures we saw last summer. What is being done to allow for some green space, for some trees, for something besides concrete and building materials in new development and refurbishing of existing development? Thank you.
Thank you very much for testifying. You've asked several questions, and the way we would handle that is to have you and staff communicate directly rather than having it be part of the meeting. Do you want to comment on that, Ms. Cherniak, of how we'll get back to Mr. Weber?
Right. We would be happy to get in touch with Mr. Weber and have a conversation and/or meeting to follow up. So we will do that after the meeting.
And I think maybe he has left us. So again, we thank him for testifying. Oh, you're there. So
yeah, I'm just saying that thank you for listening. I didn't know if this was the proper forum or not, but yeah, I would appreciate any follow-up.
Yes, so thank you again.
Thanks.
Commissioner Petrillo?
Well, I understand, Chair, you don't want to have the meeting become this, but I do want to provide my feedback as a planning commissioner, which is that corner you refer to, it previously was the Kmart complex and a gas station at the direct corner. And I mean, most of it was impervious service to begin with. And this is the fundamental conflict between trying to build more housing and density and also have a balance with greenscaping and recreational areas. But I do think if you look at most projects like that are going to have a landscaping component. It's obviously minimal when there is what they call a zero lot line type development. But I think the goal of that project was to try to maximize the density that's allowed in that area, which is really a commercial area, and introducing housing to an area or to a zone that historically wouldn't be as compatible, at least in Washington County, for residential housing. So I think it is one of those things where it's a trade-off and you're trying to balance interests. And so I just wanted to make that comment. We do need the housing, but every project can't necessarily achieve both public goals at the same time. So there's often a trade-off.
Any other comments? Okay. Do we have anyone else signed up to speak to us today?
No, but it looks like Jackie may have had her hand up.
Want to go ahead, Ms.
Or
Sato?
her virtual or hand.
My actual hand.
Or your actual hand, yeah.
Virtually appearing. I just wanted the record to reflect that Vice Chair Dye has joined us.
Thank you. And with that, I think we're ready to move on to our work sessions. And our first work session is a report on Washington County's manufactured housing communities. And I think, Ms. Cherniak, you were going to introduce our speaker.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Lockwood and Planning Commissioners. I'm Teresa Cherniak, Principal Planner with Community Planning. The first work session item today is a presentation by Andre Tremolay on a recently completed report that she worked on as temporary staff for the county's Office of Community Development. It's called the Manufactured Housing Communities Report for Washington County. Land use and transportation staff did serve as advisors and provided GIS and census information and helped with the analysis and reviewed the reports. That was primarily Ken Rencher and Kim Armstrong. It's an important and interesting topic, and this presentation is being provided at the request of Commissioners Petrillo and Morividu. So it's an information-only presentation and no action is being requested. You'll note that yesterday the Beaverton School District provided some information supporting the preservation of existing manufactured housing communities as affordable housing. So they do have interest in the topic as well. To introduce Andre, some of you may know her. She's been in the field of urban studies and affordable housing planning, it looks like for over 40 years. She formerly worked for the Office of Community Development as a housing services specialist and led the work on the Consolidated Plan and the Fair Housing Plan. So she knows the county quite well. She's been a consultant for a number of years. And worked mostly with public and nonprofit clients on community development, housing, and planning. She's done a lot of research with the Center for Urban Studies at Portland State and is also an adjunct instructor there at Portland State in the Urban Studies program. So very well regarded professional. This is Andre's last official public appearance, so she says, as either a consultant or a staff member. It's been a real pleasure to work with Andre on this project, and I know some of my staff have worked with or taken courses from her over the years, and I've really appreciated her knowledge and insights, so I know she'll be missed by many. With that, I'll turn it over to Andre.
Thank you. And first of all, a big thank you to the Planning Commission and the commissioners who invited this presentation today. I'm really super happy to be here, and I can't think about a better way to end a career than with today's presentation. It so happens that my research, when I went and did my dissertation at Portland State, was on manufactured housing. So this topic is one that's near and dear to me. I also, Teresa, thank you for mentioning the other people and your team's work on this project, especially Kim and yourself. Thank you. And a big thank you to Ken Rencher, data wrangler extraordinaire, who helped immeasurably with data access and cleaning in particular. And also a big thank you to my supervisor, boss, and colleague, Jenny Proctor, who's lurking in the background here and available to answer questions should any arise that are in her domain. So I'm going to start with framing the issue in terms of hopefully something you already know and have thought about. Kim, I believe, has talked to you about the housing as a continuum of options, starting with emergency shelter at one end and ending arguably with homeownership on the other end. And manufactured housing is an overlooked sector within the housing sector, and I think of it as being the other affordable housing. It's a type of low-cost housing that isn't really subsidized. The things that characterize it: it's made in a factory. Unlike other factory-built housing, it has an integral frame. Like a car has a chassis or a frame, and it's transported down the highway. It's pulled behind a truck, a vehicle, or a cab of a truck, and other types of prefab dwellings and so forth arrive on a flatbed truck, and it's just made a little bit differently. If we could go to the next slide. So one of the many of the manufactured housing units in Washington County are in manufactured housing communities, also known as mobile home parks and a variety of other names. And distinguishing characteristics of manufactured housing communities is something called divided asset ownership. By that, I mean that one entity, typically an investor, owns the land and common areas, and the home is owned by a homeowner, someone who considers themselves a homeowner and is very proud of it. And the relationship between the two is secured by a lease. The homeowner pays rent and a share of for their, it's called space. You'll hear me refer to the term spaces. That means the number of pads or spaces that manufactured homes can go on, and the share of common area costs. Let's go on to the next slide. So as Teresa explained, the project actually has two parts. One of which was in your packet today, and the other you can actually get online at the Office of Community Development website. And this project came into being through the county's consolidated plan, which is the plan for, I'll just say, subsidized and affordable housing in the county. And that happens every 5 years. And one of the actions in the plan called for conducting an analysis of the risk of displacement of manufactured housing residents. So that's what this study addresses. And the research report, which is the colorful document on the left, deals with three questions. What roles do manufactured housing communities play in the county's housing market? What displacement risks do the residents there face? And what resources currently exist to assist manufactured homeowners? The action plan, you'll see, is also provided online, and it falls into actions that can be undertaken in three areas. It has to do with enhance the existing housing stock, preserve the existing housing stock, and then help displaced manufactured homeowners explore options and secure a new place to live. Next slide, please. So I feel like we should have a drum roll here. This is the kind of the high level data here. And I'm just going to hit a few highlights from the report because I want to save most of your time for questions and discussion among yourselves. So Washington County has approximately 42 manufactured housing communities with about 4,000 to 4,500 spaces for home. And this particular photo is Falcon Ridge in Eugene. And Washington County, just by way of comparison, has about 8,000 subsidized housing units currently. So this is about half of the county's manufactured housing stock. And it has about 1,200 more units coming online through the Metro Bond. Next slide, please. Now, how can we describe these manufactured housing communities? Here are two dimensions. They're classified either as being family communities or 55 and older communities. And family communities often have many, many people who are older adults who live there as well. You can see that by far the largest number of communities are family communities unrestricted by age, and the greatest number of spaces also are in manufactured housing communities. And the other way to think of it is, what are the size of the manufactured housing communities? Because that has different implications for management. What happens if one of them were to close, different kinds of impacts and things like that. We have two really large manufactured housing communities, which total about 757 total spaces. Your largest group is of, I'll say medium to large, 151 to 250 spaces, and then on down. So that gives you kind of an idea that you do have some larger communities, and we'll be talking a little bit more about those later on. Let's go to the next slide. In terms of location, it's really interesting. Washington County, unincorporated Washington County, is a really major player in this area. While you have 12 communities, you also have some of the larger communities. You have almost 45% of the spaces in the county. So that's kind of a big number. Forest Grove has 15% of the spaces, and Cornelius has 9%, Hillsborough 10%, and Beaverton 8%. Beaverton used to have a lot more, but a number of them closed between 2001 and 2007. And again, that's a topic we'll get into in just a second. So let's go to the next slide. I just wanted to put briefly, and this is in the printed report, so you can take a look at it. These are your 12 manufactured housing communities in your unincorporated area. You can see the majority of them are in the urban unincorporated area inside UGB. There's 3 of them are outside.
We seem to be having a little bit of audio problem.
Okay.
Now you sound good. So why don't you go ahead and we'll see if it's gone away.
Please do interrupt me. I apologize for.
Yeah, it's back.
Okay, now. Can you hear me?
Yes, but it's a little garbled.
Okay. I'm going to disappear for a second. Is this better? Okay.
That's better.
Okay, great.
Except you're a little soft.
Let me see if I can go and adjust a setting here. Okay, let me see if I can.
You're sounding good, I think.
All right, how about now?
Good.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so you've had a nice long time to look at this slide. Here are your 12. You got a chance to see that some of you've got Heritage Village, which has over 400. You've got Royal Villas. You have Seminole Estates, and you've got Creekside, all of which are larger manufactured housing communities. Let's go on to the next slide. So one way, now let's talk a little bit about who lives in manufactured housing communities. One way to think of it, and this is a super simplified, non-technical way, but manufactured residents in Oregon are just as diverse a group as residents living in site-built housing. But there are 3 dominant clusters. One cluster is working class retirees. So basically people who retired, they may have lived in a traditional single-family detached dwelling, stick-built. Previously, they downsized and they wanted to live in community, or they moved there. Another group, which represents a significant share of the Latinx population living in manufactured housing communities, are working class families and individuals. And I'm just going to reference the Beaverton School District information here to mention that they identified that in their district, they had 657 students who live in manufactured housing communities, 88% of whose families identify as Latinx or Hispanic. And in El Monica Elementary in particular, 1 in 4 of the students there live in manufactured housing. So it can be a significant number. The other group are very low income renters, and they rent their home as well as renting the place that they live on. Let's go to the next slide. Now I'm going to give you a little bit more data, and the report has this. Next slide, please. So based on looking at American Housing Survey data from 2019, and the smallest area I could get was a 7-county region because of statistical error issues. Manufactured housing residents in the region are more likely to be lower income. They're more likely to be older. They're more likely to be a veteran, and they're more likely to have disabilities. So this was of great interest to DABS when we shared this information with them, and also the health department. In terms of reaching populations of lower income, moderate income people. Matter of fact, they had a vaccination clinic recently at a manufactured housing community. I'm really happy to report. So households, in terms of household size, it's kind of bifurcated. They tend to either have more one-person households than average, and also they have more than average households with 4 or more people, showing kind of those 3 different groups that I mentioned before. Racially and ethnically, they identify as white and Hispanic and Latinx. Next slide. In effect, manufactured housing provides a form of either naturally occurring or unsubsidized low-cost housing. And this is from a rental survey I did for Clackamas County in 2018 of housing costs in manufactured housing. And as Jeff, I think, will share later on in some slides he plans to introduce after this presentation, Commissioner Petrillo will be doing. They have the rent with the mortgage is actually less than a comparable 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom apartment in Clackamas County. And the space, if they don't have to pay, I said mortgage, is actually a loan on their home, it's less. It's typically more than what people would pay for subsidized housing, but that's why in that spectrum, it fell, the housing continuum, it fell where it did. So that's like 4,000 to 4,500 units of lower cost housing that is not subsidized. Let's go into the next slide. The other thing that's important to know is that for the people who live there, at least many of them, this is their housing of choice. They're choosing to live here. And there's a sense of pride of ownership and making do with what you have. There's a real kind of almost bootstrap mentality. And older adults choose it because they want to downsize. They want a smaller one-floor home, and they want to know their neighbors and have a clubhouse. And with Latinx family, they talk about how it's a community and how they feel their kids can play safely outdoors because neighbors are watching out for them. Let's go on to the next slide. One of the kind of things to pay attention to, though, is that manufactured homes are getting older. And some of the older manufactured homes were not originally built as well as contemporary manufactured homes are built. The average home in Washington County, and this took an incredible data dive to get this data. Matter of fact, I think you're the only county that has this kind of data available to you. The average age of your manufactured home is 38 years. That was in 2021, 39 years now, I suppose, and constructed in 1983. Next slide. But they're also vulnerable. And why are they vulnerable? Because of divided asset ownership. Let's go on to the next slide. As a matter of fact, in Washington County, during the real estate boom of the early 2000s, 15 manufactured housing communities closed in the county. And in the background is a photograph taken by Laura Russell, a professional photographer, in 2009. And I believe it's Nut Tree Estates in Beaverton that photo is of. She has a book that is available that is a picture book of that experience. So 15 manufactured home communities closed in the county. That you lost almost 1,100 housing units. 1,100 households were displaced. By the way, I was looking online. That's let's see. I think it's the entire population of Gillum County in the state is about equivalent to that. You lost 1 in 5 of your spaces, and Washington County, because you were experiencing so much growth, lost more than any other county in the state. And in my research on these closures, I discovered that I did some statistical analysis, a logistic regression, and the likelihood of closure was had a strong positive correlation with the population growth of the county, which has to do with rising land prices, and whether or not the community was inside a UGB. Those were the two strongest indicators indicating the likelihood of closure. Let's go on to the next slide. And that was statewide, not just in Washington County. So the impacts of the closures are significant. I mean, you can imagine what it would be like to lose your home. Imagine being elderly and losing your home and all that's familiar, but also you're losing your community. Their financial impacts. You lose your primary asset. Some had to declare bankruptcy if they still had a loan on their home and they didn't have a home anymore because there was no place to move it. So they actually had an asset that they owed money on, except they didn't have the asset anymore. A huge sense of health and well-being, and there was some statistical indication of premature death resulting. So in terms of the impact on jurisdictions in the public, there's an increased demand for subsidized housing. A new subsidized housing unit is averaging about $350,000 a unit these days, and that's excluding the land. So, and you're also losing self-sufficient taxpayers. And that was based on a case study of the closure of Thunderbird Manufactured Housing Community in Wilsonville. Let's go on to the next slide. The thing that is important to know, though, is that there are two types of displacement that can occur. We've talked a little bit about an entire community closes with rising land prices and development pressure and an owner seeing a way to make money, sometimes getting unsolicited offers. Or sometimes there's deferred infrastructure needs, and it just isn't cost effective to put money into their home anymore, and so they sell it for redevelopment. So that's an entire community closing, and there are state laws regulating that, but they can still close. So the other one is that we're seeing a lot of now, or more, even more of in Washington County, is when individual homeowners are displaced. And through rent increases or sometimes management practices. So rent increases in manufactured housing communities are covered under the ceiling for rent increases that apply to apartment buildings, so about 9% a year. But if you're on a fixed income, you're on Social Security, that doesn't increase 9% a year. And your housing cost is your major cost. And so I know of people who are facing displacement as a result of that. The other management practice is sometimes people decide they want, the owners of the parks decide they want fancier homes in there. And so they tell people they have all these repairs on their home that they have to do, and they have to do them within a certain time frame, or they'll be evicted. And so there's some management practices that have to do with increasing cash flow that are not necessarily beneficial for the residents who live there, or maybe less beneficial than just keeping the park going in a healthy way. Next slide. So why is the displacement risk growing? There are a host of reasons, but I want to highlight three. Rising rents overall, and the housing market overall in the county has given room for manufactured housing space rents to increase, regardless of whether or not the owners are investing more money in the property and there's actually a need. So it provides room for raising rents. There's a demand for developable land, as you know. That's your job, you know those things, and increasing land values. And then the last thing is the changing structure of the manufactured housing community industry. And in the report, I have some links to some studies about that, but essentially there's some large institutional investors that are entering the market. Supposedly they're hovering along the I-5 corridor in Oregon. I know that there's been one purchase in Clackamas County. I'm not aware of others of this particular type, and they're just in it strictly for the money, and they're not experts at manufactured housing. They're doing it because they can raise rents, get some money, and then spin it off in a few years as a midterm investment. Let's go on to the next slide. So there are a range of type of manufactured housing community owners, from mom and pop to regional and national and professional owners that are professional owners. And then the diversified private equity investors are the ones that I just mentioned that are sort of in there. And then there's a group I'm calling new opportunists, which is sort of the make money quick folks who are interested in this opportunity. And there are a couple of places you can go learn about investing in manufactured housing. Mobile Home University, Frank Rolfe is one of them. And then the last group is preserved communities. And preserved communities are owned by a resident co-op, a nonprofit, or a housing authority. And Oregon Housing and Community Services and the Network for Oregon Affordable Housing support the acquisition. And there have been, I think now it's about 30. There have been a couple more since I made this slide statewide, but none of them are in Washington County. And the reason is not for lack of trying, is that the costs have been too high given the available subsidy. Let's go the next slide. Let's go to the next, keep on that slide. The two type that you have most in Washington County are mom and pop, and then the regional and national owners. And we're going to talk about a little bit more of those in a moment. But I want to give you just a taste, the next slide, of the new opportunists, please. So these are some quotes from Frank Rolfe, Mobile Home University. One of the big drivers to make money is the ability to increase the rents. If we didn't have them hostage in those mobile home lots, it would be a whole different picture. So nobody ever leaves. Occupancy is always high. It's like running a Waffle House where everyone's chained to the booths. Let's go on to the next slide. That's not everybody. That's not all owners. I want to emphasize that. This isn't to vilify everyone who owns manufactured housing. There's some reasonable owners, and there's some reasonable investors who own them. But that is unfortunately a real issue. So one of the things to be concerned about in Washington County is that 5 owners own 36% of your communities and 40% of your spaces. So you have some concentrated ownership here, and you have some players to look at. Next slide, please. These are the big owners, and when they're corporate, I've identified them. When they're family companies, I've just provided kind of the owner location. Obviously, the county has the information about who the owner of record of these parks. So the two I want to mention is Cal-Am Properties. They look at a good part of their inventory is in unincorporated Washington County, and they own those big parks. And so they're active in 8 states. They have 7 manufactured housing communities in Oregon and 53 nationally. And they have 5 regional offices nationwide. So they're kind of big players and experts in the field. They also have pretty aggressive tactics, according to the residents who live there. Now, you could talk to them and get their side of the story, but that's what I understand from residents. The other kind of big player is West Coast Mobile Home Parks, which is Richard Delaney, and he's based in California also. And they have 22 communities in Oregon, 53 nationally, and they're in about 6 states. And again, they're typically not well regarded by residents. They're managing for cash flow. Next slide. Well, I'm going to stop there. And gosh, I just want to say again, thank you so much for this opportunity to present. I'm not going to read through the important takeaways, but Chair Lockwood, if you want to take it over, and I'm happy to answer questions as best I can. But that's a little bit about your inventory. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for that presentation. I will. Ms. Cherniak, are you? Okay, I thought maybe you wanted to make a comment. Let's go ahead with comments or questions. Commissioner Will.
I have a question for the speaker. Do you have any knowledge in researching this topic about the history of the creation of this type of housing product? Was there an impression at the beginning that was sort of like always to be a temporary process, like a land bank? Like, we got this field, let's just put some temporary housing out here until one day when the city grows and it's ready for development. In the history, was it always intended to redevelop, or was it always envisioned as a permanent housing plan?
It actually shifted, and it shifted in the mid-1970s. What happened was that prior to June 15th, 1976, there weren't any kind of national standards for manufactured homes. Not parks. I'm talking about homes. I'm going to get to parks in a second because they're related. There were no national standards. Oregon did have a code. And I think it goes back to 60 something that regulated what I think were called mobile homes then rather than manufactured homes. And but with that big shift, it basically upgraded the industry in terms of the quality of the homes, and they were double wides became more prominent. And at that point, they were not looked at as homes that you can cart off. They were looked at instead as homes that happen to be made in a factory, and that's why it's about half the cost to manufacture these as actually to build per square foot to build a site-built home. But the quality was higher, and so they were thought of as being permanent housing. At that point, and not thought of as a temporary use. And so you might know also in Oregon, one of the early things that happened is that manufactured dwellings can be permitted anywhere where single family dwellings are permitted. So, I mean, it is a permanent use. Now, it's true, early on, some of the mobile home parks were in floodplain or on land that developers were more or less land banking. But a lot of the practices shifted, as I said, around kind of in the mid-1970s and maybe a little before that, because it was clear that the market was going that way, because that's how the housing was. Those things can't be moved. It costs easily $20,000, $30,000 or more to move even a single wide manufactured home these days. And that does include site improvements on the new site and stuff like that. That's probably more of an answer than you wanted, but I could go on about this stuff forever.
I have a couple of questions. I'm not seeing other hands at the moment. One question was about the report mentions that in 2007, the legislature instituted several protections for mobile home communities. So I'm wondering, first question is whether you would suggest any further protections. And my second question is whether you anticipate more mobile homes or new mobile home communities, manufactured homes, excuse me for my getting the wrong term, more manufactured home communities being established in the future, new ones, or are we likely to just be preserving the ones that already exist?
Great questions. So let me take your first question first. So the state instituted laws, and they're summarized, I think, in the last chapter of the report. Anyway, the owners, when they put up a home for sale and it's closing, first of all, they have to notify the state and the residents when it's being put up for sale. The second thing is that if they have to provide a closure notice if it's closing, and there's all kinds of rules about the way it's delivered and what has to be in it. And that notice has to be delivered a year in advance of the closure. So that's kind of the big deal. Residents also have the ability to form a co-op and purchase if they can do it. In CASA of Oregon, who's active in this area, is the one that helps groups organize along those lines. In terms of adopting additional provisions, I wish. But the deal that was struck in terms of, can you require additional protections in the event of a closure? The state preempts local communities from adopting rules that are different than what the state has in place. There are a few exceptions to that, and actually, Washington County has has a city, Sherwood, that is an exception community. It has pre-existing protections for residents that even go beyond what the state did, and requires housing counseling and other kinds of things. And that was put in place before the state laws were adopted. But that is the only community in Washington County that can or does have different rules than apply statewide. Wilsonville, there are several places that have different laws, but that's the only one in the county. And your second question, Chair Lockwood, if you could help me remember.
Do you envision new manufactured home communities being established?
That's a really good question. So one of the things that we all know is that people are looking at smaller housing and smaller housing units. And a recent change in state law this legislative session now allows single-wide manufactured homes to be located anywhere. So I'm not sure about an investor-owned community that's possible. What I do imagine is manufactured dwellings of different being used both as in small lot subdivisions. It makes for affordable housing that way, because the housing cost is about half. And then you still have the land costs, which are what they are, but if it's a smaller lot, it's less expensive. And then the other potential application, interestingly, is I don't know if you allow for detached units and stuff, but potentially as detached plexes, or in as detached or as cottages in cottage clusters. Those are potential applications that I can see those being used. And one other quick thing I forgot to mention. Manufactured housing communities also allow prefab dwellings now to be located there, and that's a new development. So when you're thinking about replacement housing, it can be prefab dwellings as well as the traditional manufactured home. Does that answer?
Yeah, thank you. Commissioner Baidu.
Thank you, Chair Lockwood. Just for full disclosure, I work for Network for Oregon Affordable Housing for my day job, and I work heavily with CASA of Oregon, and have been involved in a lot of the preservation efforts for manufactured housing and cooperatives. So my question has to do with establishing new manufactured home parks. There hasn't been a lot of new developments, or any statewide, very few, in the last even 20 to 25 years. And I was wondering, how, in your opinion, can we support the industry to essentially increase the stock of available manufactured housing, and also along with that, what's needed to really change the stigma behind how the public views manufactured housing? Because I've been to a lot of manufactured housing parks, and I have to admit, before I worked on a lot of deals that have to do with these communities, I had a preconceived notion, and my assumptions were crushed, basically, when I went to visit. A lot of these communities are full of sometimes beautiful houses, and people who really care about keeping their homes and gardens looking nice. And there are communities out there that are much more low income or aren't taken care of as well. But there's definitely a stigma, and I think that I'm wondering what your opinion is on how to change that.
Well, I think one thing to look at has to do with the use of manufactured housing on small lots and small lot subdivisions. And you've got the most wonderful experiment in that may take place. And I'm forgetting the name of the community that just incorporated a whole bunch of land inside the UGB and is doing planning now for that. Teresa or Kim, can you help me? Yes, King City. So King City is a place, I think, to watch in terms of changing the perception of what it's about. The other thing I'm really excited about is the fact that you now are starting to see the introduction of modular and other kinds of homes into manufactured housing communities. And I think that as we start to incorporate these other housing types that perhaps don't have as identifiable as a shape, we might start to see, some changes there too. But I think making manufactured housing part of the fabric of the community, like King City is doing, is a very exciting development because it no longer becomes an enclave that's mysterious and identifiable. There's also the possibility of traditional ownership there, as well as investor-owned, land and units. So I think those developments, and also incorporating it in some of the other uses that I mentioned, I think will help as well. Other than that, I don't have a magic wand. I mean, we've all heard the deplorable names for people who live in manufactured housing, and I'm not going to repeat them here. But I'm hoping that we'll have some new thinking about that.
Commissioner Petrillo.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Andre, for coming. I think part of, I do think the stigma issue is a significant issue. And it's not, there's two stigmas. One is a public stigma, at least historically and culturally, and Hollywood, obviously, and our culture sort of has perpetuated that. And then there's industry bias too. I mean, architects, home builders, even, should I say, planners, realtors, the whole industry is, it's probably not their first choice if they were to do a development for a variety of reasons. But that's clearly one of them. But I think I just want to make a couple of comments. One was, there's some big names that have moved into this industry. It is not like they're moving in; they've moved in. And Sam Zell's firm, which is probably one of the largest in the country, is one of them. Being deplorable isn't a criminal in the criminal code, but Clayton Homes, which produces sort of the other spectrum of manufactured homes, and as we're talking about as sort of infill or even small subdivisions, is Warren Buffett's operation. So there's clearly a lot of money, and I do think sometimes there's conflation of the issues, because the spectrum of manufactured housing is everything from what we call mobile home to sort of the Clayton home subdivisions, or even higher end than that, which you wouldn't even know that they're were manufactured in a factory and put on site. And I think that there's two things happening. On the higher end, it's allowing for more efficient building, particularly when costs are extraordinary, as they are now, or labor. In the lower end, it's how do we preserve the housing, because as your report indicates, if these people are displaced who live in the median and below a part of the market, where do they go? And replacement housing stick build, I think you quoted 375. I haven't seen 375 a unit in a couple of years. They're really pushing toward 475, and we're going north of that. This is on the regulated affordable housing, typically built under the tax credit program. But I guess if you could, I'm going to ask staff, I did sort of clear this with the chair. I want to show, I follow the investment market, real estate investment market. If you put up, I got to see if I can even see it. There we are. But you put up that chart. This is commercial, the CPPI is Commercial Property Price Index. It's actually a proprietary index of a firm called Green Street, so I need to attribute that. But it gives you an idea of what manufactured housing is the top line there, and it's just taken off over the last 5 years, and it's been it's an accelerating trend. So there's a rush to get into the market. This was a market that traditionally was a very fragmented market. It was often local landlords. Some of them would be stereotypical landlords with a cigar and a Cadillac DeVille pulling in to pick up the checks. And, I'm sort of stereotyping, but it wasn't the respectable part of the real estate business. Again, the stigma part. It was almost like, tenant farming in terms of, tenants have no interest in the land and they're just living on it and they're paying rent. And so this just gives you an idea that Wall Street and a lot of commercial real estate, institutional real estate money is flooding into this market. It still is. It's because the returns are quite high relative to having to maintain or do replacement capital over time. It has the lowest cost of replacement capital in terms of maintenance. And so it has a high return on investment. And so everyone's sort of like, that's the religion. And unfortunately, it's also the culprit that many in this market at the lower end, and some of the poor stories we've had. Could you put the second slide up there too? And this just shows you manufactured homes have increased, and COVID kind of accelerated everything in our world. And one of the things it did was it accelerated trends in our world, social and economic trends. And one of them was, manufactured home wasn't the highest, but it was 34% increase from the beginning, which would have been like March 2020. And even 12 months was 24%. But you can also see the pandemic influence. One is the industrial, with the supply chains having to move to e-commerce and self-storage, as there was a lot more change in people's status of their stuff and where they live during COVID. So these are, I think these market wins are really the biggest threat to this all. And the co-op effort just seems too slow and too little. And there's just not enough capital, or really, even though the state has made a good effort, I think that we went from, I think I just wrote down here, 4 million manufactured homes in 2018, that's in the United States, to 1.7 and that was 2018, to 1.7 in 2023. Unfortunately, that's the trend. And I would, as a public policy and even as a planning perspective, because again, when we talk about housing, at least in Oregon, we're talking about Goal 10, maybe the housing authorities need to take a look at this and prioritize, or local jurisdictions themselves, counties, cities, but counties often because they're in the more rural areas. I mean, Washington County would be typical. Wallowa County, some of the is for jurisdictions, if they had the capital, to purchase some of these when they go up for sale. Land bank them. And because the system we work under with real estate, the property market, it's the land becomes so valuable at some point in some areas that the value of the mobile home improvements are minimal. And so it's an inevitable path where somebody is going to be knocking on the landlord's door and offering them a amount of money they can't resist. And unless, I don't know, that's the trend. And I'm not sure, as you said, or as Commissioner Badu mentioned, we need to figure out innovative approaches. It might even take a federal approach. And then the other part is, and you didn't mention it, but I'm wondering, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but on the lower end, or the lower half of manufactured housing, the mobile home park type, these aren't considered real estate. And so they have a sort of a legal obstacle as well, because they're considered personal property. And because they're not secure, even though they are set on a foundation or something that holds them in place in many places, they're not classified as real estate, which is a fixture to the land. They're classified legally in most jurisdictions, state jurisdictions, as personal property, which creates a sort of a legal problem where it's like, are we talking about is this housing or is this personal property? And the division that you talk about is something that is, it's a fundamental conflict and problem, because they can't most people are stuck. And so this is the tenant farming thing, or the indentured servant type situation in the worst case scenarios. And it's sad in many cases to see what happens when there is and we've had it in Beaverton. However, and then I just, on the flip side of that, I'm hoping in American goodwill spirit that maybe the interest of Wall Street in the moneyed interest in manufacturing, maybe that's what helps mitigate the stigma, because maybe it becomes a recognized and respectable housing asset, and it's not viewed as a sub-asset or a less desirable one. And the money they bring in makes them look more, they're more presentable. They're attractive, although many of them are. But just that the image improves, because the investors, I would say more of the institutional investors, not the ones who are the private investors, the publicly traded ones, their interest is that their properties do well and look well. And that might help, even though it's going to still, I think, result in elimination of many lower cost units that existed previously. So, and I guess I'm not going to ask how you would propose preservation. I think Commissioner Badu mentioned that, but we just came off a long string of meetings on middle housing, the House Bill 2001, and how, I guess I was just wondering, how do you see middle housing, if you do, manufactured housing contributing toward middle housing goals of the state? Or do you?
Yes, I do. And in particular, it can be used as, now that single wides are allowed in the state, it can be, manufactured housing can be used as cottages cottage clusters. It can be used as, if I don't know if your ordinance now contemplates detached plexus.
Considering it.
If it's allowed on a parcel and the site works and all like that, I mean, it would be allowed because it doesn't have to be a double wide anymore. It doesn't have to be over 1,000 square feet anymore. It can be a smaller unit. It meets the definition of it can meet those things. So I'm not so sure about an ADU. I think the ADU square footage might be too small for a manufactured home, but it could play a role in those other things. There's also something called a park model manufactured home, which is a little bit smaller than a traditional manufactured home that might be relevant there. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I just we didn't discuss it much as a type, other than staff saying, well, it's not prohibited and it's just considered regular housing. But I think sometimes we have to look at it more than that. We have to say, well, maybe we need to encourage that as a way to, because the idea of middle housing is to create more affordable options as well as types of housing. So I'll leave it there. I see Commissioner Will has a question or comment.
Commissioner Will.
Yeah, thank you. Commissioner Petrillo's comments raised a question I had about the, you mentioned two different types of, I think, large investors and then midterm investors. So is it maybe too early to see what the trends are, over the long term, since, we're just talking in decades here? Are these investors that are coming in, are the majority of them looking to buy and hold and perhaps improve their properties because they can have long-term income from them over the investment, long-term investment? Or when we talk about larger investors coming in, are all of them, planning on selling after getting as much income in the short term as possible and then flipping it?
So my understanding, and this is based on what other people's research, because I'm not super smart at understanding all those larger investment REITs and stuff like that, that they're looking at it as a midterm investment of 7 to 10 years. In other words, increase the cash flow, do some things to beautify the park, but maybe don't deal with infrastructure and things like that, but make it look nicer, paint the clubhouse, redo some landscaping, things like that. And then raise the rents, whatever the particular state will allow, and the agreements that they have with the renters, the homeowners allow, and then eventually spin it off. Whether that in fact happens that way, I don't know. It's a good question I've been asking, because once they've essentially captured all the profit there and someone buys it at a higher level, there's not a lot of room in the budget, in the management budget, if someone buys it at a higher, per space price to necessarily put in improvements, because all your money went into financing the acquisition. So I don't know, and I'm really worried about that. And I'm really glad that some of those larger investors that I'm talking about are in the market. I will say though that CalAm and some of the others that I've mentioned are in it for the long haul. This is their business. This is what they do. They're not buying parks to trade like, monopoly deeds or whatever. I mean, this is what they do, and you can like what they do or not like what they do, but they're not short term in what they think. So corporate doesn't equal short term, midterm, or short term. Well, it's a little bit more nuanced than that.
Chair and Commissioner Badu, can I respond to Commissioner Will's? Just because I do know this area of the market, and which is
Yeah.
The REITs who are operating in this area, by IRS standard, they have to. They're an income vehicle. They pass on 95% of their profit, and people, their investors or shareholders are owning them for income, and so Sun Communities, Equity Lifestyle, many of them, they're not into just the flipping or. And it has a relatively, even if you don't have a long-term plan, it still has a relatively high rate of investment because there's the capital improvements that are expenditures that you often need to make in real estate. It has one of the lowest, so therefore, capital investment reduces your return. Apartments have to constantly be upgraded. Hotels, across the spectrum. This you're getting the income, then I've seen some of the prospectus on these things, or prospecta, I guess, on these which is that it's like invest with us because you're going to get a X percent return that's going to increase with inflation as we increase our rents, and of course rents are. It's like they'll increase the rents. To some degree, their rents are limited by what the market is, right? At some point, people will say, I'm not going to pay that. I'm going to go rent an apartment that's cheaper. But so there is some natural limit in many markets. But I don't mean right now. Right now, we have a out of balanced market. So, but when they do that, they also say, and what you're buying as an investor is a put option, which is at the end of the day, let's just say we are done with this, or this project does flatten out. We've got a put option where we could just sell the land. You can't do that with an old apartment building. You can't, you can sell it for the development land, but it's not typical. Whereas manufactured homes, you buy it right. You are looking forward in time to say, where's my put option to sell the land if necessary? And many of these manufactured homes, particularly the early legacy ones, have sort of defaulted into that because they didn't exist in incorporated areas. They were annexed in, or they weren't development areas at the time they were developed. Many of them are floodplains, not necessarily maybe in Oregon, but I know elsewhere they are. Just wanted to mention that.
Commissioner Vidu.
Thank you. I had a response for Commissioner Will as well related. So of the parks that I've underwritten, which is probably 15 or so in the last couple of years, I would just mention that none of them had upgrades to the infrastructure. A lot of the manufactured home parks are either on septic or well, or if they are connected to municipal services, those connections have not been upgraded at all since the initial construction of the park. So a lot of times, the investors with the intent of selling after a few years, they will just purchase the park, hold it for that amount of time, patch those infrastructure, the infrastructure as it starts to crumble as needed. But then when it comes down to it, as demonstrated by the slide that showed the age, of the majority of the parks, we're in a space now where like the entire infrastructure for a lot of these parks needs to be completely replaced. So we're kind of entering, I think, a new space in the market where, there are going to be either some major upgrades needed because those infrastructure systems just won't be viable anymore. Or just, the continuation of patching and kind of a degradation of the community as a whole. And the upgrades are shockingly expensive. I worked on a park in Milwaukee, just outside, it's in Gladstone. year before last, and it has mid hundreds of units. And I think the total infrastructure requirements for replacement were in the range of $3 million. So it's going to be something that the market is going to have to confront, in the next 10 or, starting now, but definitely in the next 10 years.
I guess I have a question for staff based on what we've been talking around in the last few minutes. Are there code changes that are at all implicated here or
contemplated?
Yeah, contemplated.
I would say there are no code changes contemplated at this time. There are potential code. There are potential code things that can happen. Portland is the only one that I'm aware of that has done something. I see Andre has her hand up, so I'll continue and then let her answer. So one of the items in the report action plan was the possibility of exploring code options. That's something that we could consider as part of a future work program. But at this time, that's not something that's in our work program or that the board has directed us to look at.
Okay. Ms. Tremolay?
I just wanted to add that Cornelius also has an option whereby they have a manufactured dwelling zone, and pretty much the only use, there are a few other uses that are allowed there, is our manufactured dwelling parks. And so it's the intention's preservation, and that's what Portland did too. It is not an easy route. There are a host of legal issues, including Measure 47 and Measure 49 takings issues that you have to think of strategies to avoid. But I mean, it is something that is out there. The other thing that I know staff really wanted me to emphasize too is that we do have resources, $500,000, $500,000 available through the county's Housing Opportunity Fund. That is earmarked for helping with the acquisition of a manufactured housing community, or more than one possibly, but it's $500,000. And so in terms of the preservation route, we haven't run numbers and to know if that is enough money to make it feasible or what size park it would make feasible, but we do have that resource available. If anyone's interested in following up on that, Jenny Proctor with the Office of Community Development is the person to contact, and I encourage you to do that. So the short answer is yes, there's a land use act option. Yes, is fraught with a lot of challenges. Yes, there may or may not be political support for it. So that's a whole other can of worms. And then there are also issues of once you've preserved a community, how do you continue to invest in it such that the housing and infrastructure is sound? So we have some ideas, and the work plan, we do not have the silver bullet. But if we're looking at 4,000 homes, which is equivalent to half of your subsidized housing stock overall in the county at risk, that's a huge thing. And so we wanted to offer some ideas, even though we don't have the perfect answer.
Any other comments or questions? Yeah, I'm not seeing any. Well, thank you, Ms. Tourmalet, for your expert sharing all that expert knowledge with us. And I feel that I got a window onto something I wasn't terribly aware of before, and it really is, I think, an important niche to be thinking about. So thank you. And we are at about 90 minutes, which is when we typically take a break. So unless there's an objection, we'll have a 5-minute break. All right, we're adjourned for 5 minutes. Commissioners, if you're back, would you please turn your cameras on? So, may we have the roll call, please?
Yes. Commissioner Bidu,
Present.
Commissioner Havner,
Present.
Commissioner Petrillo,
Present.
Commissioner Podar,
Present. Thank you.
Commissioner Will,
Present.
Vice Chair Dye,
Present.
Chair Lockwood,
Present.
we have 7 present. We have a quorum.
Thank you.
Mhm.
All right. I think we're ready for our second work session item. Go ahead.
I'll do a really quick thing. Sorry. Teresa Cherniak again, Principal Planner with Community Planning. Many of you will remember this, but some won't. A year and a half ago, actually, this is the wrong presentation. Sorry. So I was like, that's not the right ordinance number. A year and a half ago, in 2020, ordinance number 869 came through the Planning Commission. And at that time, we talked a lot about the county's significant natural resource regulations and Goal 5. But some planning commissioners have joined since then. So Michelle's going to give the presentation on the Land Use Board of Appeals remand of our significant natural resource regulations. And she'll start with maybe a bit more background than we might normally do, just to get everyone kind of up to speed on where we started from, so that we can talk about where we're headed. So with that, I'll turn it over to Michelle.
Phew, I'm glad I don't have to talk about middle housing. I wouldn't be a very good expert there. So good afternoon, Chair Lockwood and Planning Commissioners. I'm Michelle Miller, Senior Planner in Community Planning with the Land Use and Transportation Division. Today's presentation is an update on the recent Land Use Board of Appeals remand of the significant natural resource regulations that were adopted by the board back in 2020. Next slide, please. So today's agenda will include a very brief overview of statewide planning goal and the history of the county's Goal 5 program. Then we'll review the legal challenges to the natural resource regulations that we've encountered over the past few years and go over the most recent LUBA decision.
Michelle, we're actually one slide ahead, so if we could go back one slide.
There we go. Thanks. Okay, the latest LUBA decision will serve as the guide for making the changes that we need to do for the regulations on remand. So we briefed the board on this issue at a work session on April 19th, and we wanted to share with you the feedback that we received. The board has indicated an interest in the Planning Commission serving an integral role in reviewing the changes to the natural resource regulations and engaging with the public in the decision-making process. And finally, we'll go over the preliminary timeline for addressing the remand. Next slide. So it's been a while since we last met on this topic, and for some of you, it's a new issue, so a refresher might be in order. Goal 5 is one of the statewide planning goals that apply to natural resources, scenic and historic areas, and open spaces. Our focus today is on the Goal 5 requirements for natural resources. So the Goal 5 rules require local jurisdictions follow a series of steps to meet the intent of Goal 5. The first step is to inventory the natural resources and then decide which ones are significant and consider the land uses that could conflict or impact the significant natural resources. Then an analysis follows looking at the consequences of allowing, limiting, or prohibiting the activity on the sites that contain natural resources. And then a decision is made whether to allow, limit, or prohibit the activity based on this analysis. Finally, adopt policies and regulations that reflect this decision. And these steps are all outlined in the statewide Oregon administrative rules. Of note, the state regulations for Goal 5 focus on the process and not prescriptive requirements, and allow jurisdictions to develop their own Goal 5 programs and rules. Next slide. So the county first completed the Goal 5 process in the early 1980s under the original Goal 5 Administrative Rules, Division 16, and the State Department of Land Conservation and Development acknowledged this program. Goal 5 policies and rules can be found in most of the county's comprehensive plan documents and apply to rural and urban lands. Changes to the OARs in 1996 under Division 23 gave Metro, the regional government agency, the authority to plan for fish and wildlife habitat protection in the Portland metropolitan region and adopted a program into its functional plan. Local governments must now meet the minimum requirements of the functional plan for regional resources rather than the requirements of the state Division 23 OARs. Metro adopted Title 13, known as Nature in the Neighborhoods, in 2005, giving local jurisdictions a set of options for complying with its Fish and Wildlife Habitat Protection Plan. The county and regional partners developed the Tualatin Basin Program to comply with Metro Title 13 as one of the compliance options. The program's primary regulatory decision was to limit development in water-related resources and associated habitat areas. In 2006, the county amended its comprehensive plan to implement the Tualatin Basin Program. For more details on the extensive history of Goal 5 and our program elements, you can turn to our Significant Natural Resource Program Review and Assessment, which we finalized in May of 2020. I'm sure you've all have a copy of that handy. Next slide. So this slide shows a portion of the mapped and inventoried natural resources that fall under the rules of Community Development Code CDC Section 422, the Significant Natural Resource section. If a property has one of these resources on their site, they must follow those rules during the development process. The legend on the right side of the slide names the resource and shows its corresponding mapped color. The first three highlight the county's resources. The blue areas are the county's water-related resources like streams and creeks and adjacent habitat, with the dark green areas showing the mapped county wildlife habitat. The last two on the legend are the Metro Riparian Habitat Class 1 and 2 areas, shown in the bright green colors from the inventory that Metro conducted in the early 2000s. You can see on the map where they differ from the county's resources and areas where they might overlap or are slightly different. Next slide. This slide shows the size of the total area and proportion of the natural resources we discussed in that last slide that are within the urban unincorporated area of the county. It shows the portion where the resources are individually mapped and the size of the area where there are overlaps between the county resources and the Metro Riparian Habitat areas. This pie chart shows that a substantial portion of the natural resources, just under 3,500 acres, are water-related resources and protected by the most restrictive standards found in Section 422. Next slide. As I touched on a bit earlier, the county has had an acknowledged Goal 5 program that's been in place for many years that was established following the older Division 16 rules. Then, in 2017, the state legislature passed a series of laws to address the housing crisis. And one of those changes, SB 1051, requires local jurisdictions have clear and objective standards to make it easier for housing projects to move through the land development review process more quickly and consistently. This change at the state level brought to light issues with the county's natural resource standards that were not clear and objective, and several legal challenges followed that I will talk about shortly in detail. It includes the LUBA appeal of the county's decision in Crestline, an enforcement order, and the remand of ordinance number 869A. The most recent LUBA remand revealed that the county has continued issues with its natural resource regulations, which will need to be addressed. Next slide. In 2018, the Land Use Board of Appeals affirmed a county hearing officer decision known as Crestline. The application was for a 6-lot subdivision with identified significant natural resources located in the Metzger Progress Community Plan area. The county hearings officer found that 3 of the county's natural resource standards that applied to both water-related natural resources and wildlife habitat could not be enforced as the standards were not clear and objective. In affirming this decision, LUBA found that the recent state law changes with SB 1051 require clear and objective standards for all land to be developed for housing. The LUBA decision was affirmed by the Court of Appeals in 2019. Next slide. Following this LUBA decision, Land Use Board of Appeals decision, the same parties filed an enforcement order petition with the Land Conservation and Development Commission. LCDC found the county out of compliance with the Goal 5 because the county could not enforce the 3 natural resource standards that were an integral component of the county's Goal 5 program. LCDC also put an injunction in place until the county adopted regulations to address the issue. It meant that the county was not able to approve land use applications that could impact wildlife habitat until changes were made with the clear and objective standards. Next slide. So in 2020, the county adopted A engrossed ordinance number 869 and related habitat assessment guidelines to address the enforcement order. The objectives of the ordinance was to address the standards that were not clear and objective and make some minor changes that would aid in the development review process on sites with significant natural resources. For water-related resources, it meant retaining the same limitations on what was allowed in these areas while making the standards clear and objective. For wildlife habitat areas, it meant retaining a certain portion of the wildlife habitat areas to be preserved as mitigation and allowing the remainder of the site to be developed. Habitat assessment guidelines were adopted later through a separate resolution and order process that detailed the requirements and the process for sites with wildlife habitat. When the ordinance was adopted, the enforcement order was lifted shortly thereafter. The ordinance 869A and the guidelines were then appealed to LUBA in 2021. Next slide. So LUBA issued their decision in the fall of 2021 and remanded the ordinance back to the county. The habitat assessment guidelines were also remanded by a separate LUBA order that followed. So the main takeaway in that decision was the county needs to follow the most current state Oregon Administrative Rules, Division 23, when making any changes to its natural resource regulation. It means the rules and any standards that are referenced in must be clear and objective. LUBA also found that the county must make findings on the record that all of the statewide planning goals are being balanced. In this case, LUBA highlighted the need to consider statewide planning goal 10 for housing. Concerning the habitat assessment guideline ruling, there must be an opportunity for public review and comment on the guidelines, and that needed to be made available at the same time the ordinance was adopted. LUBA also found that the guidelines include aspects that directly govern the use of land and should have followed the process of the county charter for adopting the land use ordinance. Next slide. As staff explored some options, it became clear that responding very narrowly to the LUBA remand was not advisable. The LUBA decision was not narrow, and it had implications for other county regulations throughout the other elements of our comprehensive plan. The intention of the approach we're taking and recommending is to provide a workable and understandable set of regulations that are also legally defensible to help minimize further legal challenges. The recommendation is to prepare changes to the standards that are explicitly called out by LUBA and other references in the regulations that could be implicated by the LUBA decision. Next slide. Regarding wildlife habitat, since we began working on this issue with the SNR Program Review and Assessment Report, wildlife habitat has been the main focus of the community's concern. The approach taken in AN Gross Ordinance number 869 was to take certain subjective standards and make them clear and objective by keeping all other aspects of the county's Goal 5 process the same. In the case of wildlife habitat, the standard required applicants to calculate the area of wildlife habitat and preserve a certain amount of that habitat area in a non-buildable tract or conservation easement. LUBA found aspects of this process not to be clear and objective, so at the very least, staff will review the standard through that lens. There is an opportunity to discuss options for wildlife habitat within this approach to seek some common ground with interested community stakeholders. And this review also provides an opening to consider other possible ways to make that subjective standard clear and objective. Next slide. This graphic with the different aspects of mapped wildlife habitat and its status in the urban unincorporated areas of the county. With the SNR assessment, we looked at what has happened over time to the mapped wildlife habitat. Some of the areas have developed, and that includes areas of mitigation where the wildlife habitat is protected in tracts. While some sites have not developed and may contain some wildlife habitat that was inventoried in the 1980s. Some of the remaining wildlife habitat is located on sites with development potential, shown in darker green, in the darker green section, and would likely be subject to the regulations that we will be working on. The smaller pie chart graphic on the right breaks down the wildlife habitat with development potential, further showing the breakdown that about 1/3 of what is considered wildlife habitat has mapped riparian habitat, the metro category. Where wildlife habitat overlaps with riparian habitat, it generally includes stricter limitations on development and is more stringently protected. Next slide. So we offered the board some additional options for wildlife habitat, including updating the inventory we currently have, and there was some interest from the board to learn more about making these types of changes to the inventory. They asked us to come back in June with more information about some changes, including order of magnitude options on what it might cost, how long it might take, and what are the opportunity costs might be if we do so. We're looking into this now and are scheduled to go back to the board June 21st with this information. This is where understanding the Goal 5 steps I spoke of before become important. Changing the county's wildlife habitat inventory would mean starting earlier in the Goal 5 process than we had anticipated. We'd use the revised wildlife habitat inventory as the foundation for following the other steps of the Goal 5 process I discussed earlier to get to the place of holding hearings on the engrossed ordinance. When we look back at the county's natural resource policies in the comprehensive plan, there's not clear direction for deciding on an appropriate degree of protection or mitigation for the wildlife habitat. As devised under the original county program, each development project was evaluated on a case-by-case basis, looking at the site and habitat conditions to balance the amount of interference to the habitat with the need for housing and to allow for mitigating the impacts. When we discussed these options with the board, they wanted to get some more information on the alternatives listed on this slide. Next slide. So staff recommended to the board that we prepare a Be Engrossed Ordinance 869 and make the changes identified and implied by the LUBA decision. To consider alternatives for addressing the wildlife habitat protection and mitigation within the previously established parameters of the earlier ordinance, and review the proposed changes with interested groups and community members prior to the hearings. It could range and remand the engrossed ordinance to the PC for further considerations, public hearings, and recommendations on further engrossment. This is the recommended framework for the process pending the decisions the board will make about the Goal 5 inventory and process. Since the inventory is an initial step in the Goal 5 process, the recommended approach could change depending on the extent of the inventory work that the board desires. Next slide, sorry. With the remand of engrossed ordinance number 869, the effect is though the ordinance was not adopted, and we revert to the original section 422. Staff and County Council recommend the changes needed to address the remand be made through a de-engrossment. The board has indicated an interest in remanding the ordinance back to the PC for further process, including public hearings and recommendations on engrossment. The ordinance would then return to the board for adoption through the engrossment process. The board can limit the scope it would like the PC to do and provide policy direction to on the content and framework for their consideration. Staff expects that the PC would be engaged in this issue and interested in participating on the ordinance development. Next slide. So we aren't sure yet what the board will direct us to do. We know that some members of the public and some environmental groups are very interested and concerned, and the PC and the extent and type of review will vary depending on what the board directs us. But some possibilities include meetings and listening sessions with individuals, stakeholders, community, and environmental groups, online or in-person open house meetings to exchange information on important milestones. And the PC's Planning Commission's involvement could entail multiple work sessions for status updates and to provide feedback, ultimately leading to the Planning Commission hearings on the ordinance. One certainty in all of this now is that the board wants the Planning Commission to have an integral role in listening to the community concerns and weighing in on all the Goal 5 process entails. Next slide. Some preliminary work has been done, however, there is still a significant amount and coordination that needs to happen. The first order of business is for the board to consider the options for any changes to the wildlife habitat inventory, which will happen in June. Depending on that outcome, the board's direction on changes to the wildlife habitat inventory may affect the timing of what happens. Staff estimates the work to develop the revised regulations could take about 6 months, followed by some amount of public process. And the new regulations could be potentially filed with hearings to be held in 2023. Next slide. Since the ordinance is not in effect, its requirements are not being applied to development applications. Applicants are being advised that the county's regulations are in flux, and there's risk to moving forward with applications that might impact natural resources, particularly those with wildlife habitat. If applicants elect to move forward with applicants with on-site natural resources are being required to address statewide planning goal directly and make findings on based on the earlier version of Section 422. An application for a subdivision with wildlife habitat using this approach has been approved by staff in April. This decision has been appealed to the county hearings officer, and a hearing will likely be held sometime this month. Next slide. With that, I will take any questions or comments that you have. Try to answer that.
Questions, commissioners, or comments? Well, I have a question. I'd like to get an idea of what an inventory might look like. What are the different processes that might be used? And it seems like recalling that slide with pie charts, like that we've already identified, I don't know, roughly 1,000 acres, with 300 of them with development potential. I'm just wondering, would the staff start over? Would looking at aerial images of the county to sort of identify candidate area? I mean, where would you start if you were directed to do an inventory?
So thanks for that question. That's a good one. There would likely be a range of options. One of those would be potentially looking at it anew, looking at the county inventory. It would probably most likely involve a consultant impact with environmental expertise to take a look at what we would be inventorying. But we also have existing inventories, one done by the county originally, and the inventory that was conducted by Metro. That's the regional inventory of fish and wildlife habitat. So we have some starting points to work from, and there could be a range of options within that.
Yeah, so I'm not remembering that the county one is from the 80s, and the Metro one would be from when?
That was conducted in the early 2000s.
Okay.
And that was part of the work establishing Title 13 and the Nature in the Neighborhood.
Right.
The neighborhood program.
Yeah.
And we continue to apply the riparian habitat Class 1 and 2 inventory. That's already implemented in our regulations and apply. Those areas are subject to the regulations of 422 already.
I think that where we likely will start to do a new inventory would be, I think, quite a costly endeavor, and there have been a lot of efforts already done. And so the first thing we're looking at is what has been done. When was it done? Are there issues with it? There are some other efforts by other groups as well. So our initial thought is to use what has been done first. Wildlife habitat is one of those touchy subjects because under the Metro rules, they did do an inventory, but protection is not required. And so voluntary means to preserve some areas are all that's required under Metro. So there are implications to what you inventory. And so that's what we're starting to explore is what are the different possibilities. So we'll have a better answer probably in June to that question.
Yeah, so if you used sort of a lot of existing information and you came up with a preliminary inventory, would it then be subject to public comment? Because I'm thinking about the different groups that are interested and whether they'll get a chance to talk about a proposal or how that would work.
Well, I think part of what we are going to be preparing for the board is what does it mean to do an inventory? None of us have been here before to do one. Inventory is just the first step in that whole Goal 5 process. So we can't just do the inventory, we have to do all of the steps if we do a new or updated inventory. So I guess that's still also to be determined what
the process.
At what point do you do the public process? Do you do it with inventory? Do you do it when you do the analysis of potential conflicting uses? And that's what we're still exploring.
Thank you.
I might add that I think your instincts, Chair, on the question, if I'm interpreting them, are pretty spot on. That does open up a potential can of worms that you could end up with people, assuming we have a finite inventory, who say, well, you didn't inventory this, and that's significant. And you will also probably hear from others, if we do a new inventory and new things are mapped, who will argue the other side of saying, no, that's not significant. It shouldn't be part of an inventory. So it does raise a new level of issues that, at least the last time we did this, we didn't really tackle that. We had the map as being fixed. We were just worried about the rules. So
another element to an inventory is, you've heard it once already, measure 37 and 49 and potential takings issues. And that was essentially what happened during the process with Metro and the mapping that they did about wildlife habitat. The decision was made that there would be no additional regulations about the wildlife habitat, in large part because of concerns with takings and measure 37 and 49 claims. So I think we need to be thinking about that as well and identifying new areas. And if you identify new areas, there's a lot of notification that you need to do of the people whose property is newly shown. And so it quickly kind of balloons out from there.
Yeah. And the inventory would be all of unincorporated Washington County. Is that right? If it were done?
Probably it would be the urban area.
Right. Yeah. Urban unincorporated. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions or comments? Not seeing any, so thank you very much, Ms. Miller and others. I think we're ready to move to our next item on the agenda, which is consideration of minutes. And we have 3 sets of minutes today to consider approval. The first one is March 2nd, 2022. Does anyone have any corrections to offer on that set of minutes? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands up. I move that we accept the minutes for March 2nd, 2022 as submitted. Is there any objection to that? Seeing none, those minutes are accepted as submitted. Let's move on to the next set, which is March 16th, 2022. Are there any corrections for that? Okay, I'm not seeing any, and I move that we accept the minutes for March 16th, 2022 as submitted. Oh yes, thank you, Ms. Sato.
I just wanted to say, if you're going to move for something, there should be a second.
Okay, so would you like to suggest some language where we?
No, you can just ask whether anybody seconds the motion.
I'll second.
All right, so should I move back to the second or simply stay where we are?
Yeah, just it's okay to stay where you are as long as as it's corrected. It's okay.
Okay, so I think we've had a second.
Second.
From Commissioner Petrillo, if I heard right. Is there any objection? All right, without objection, those minutes for March 16th are accepted as submitted. And then the minutes for March.
I think the second was Commissioner Dye, Vice Chair Dye.
Vice Chair Dye. Is that correct, Vice Chair Dye?
It is. I was feeling very happy that I had that much gravitas to be confused with Commissioner Petrillo.
Yeah, we don't want to take that away. All right, Vice Chair Dye seconded that one. All right. The minutes for March 30th, 2022. I see your hand up, Commissioner Will.
Well, I was just wondering, is there some sort of a different language, Jacqueline, that you would recommend, like a unanimous consent, so we don't have to do first and seconds?
You know, that's a good question, because at the end of the day, what we're talking about are the approval of the minutes. There's a lot of leeway, and what I prefer is just that it be done a certain way and that it just stay consistent. And it's just my observation that things kind of move around a little bit. And so I don't have any suggested, language for the chair to follow in particular, but I just think that in terms of the basics of Roberts is if there's going to be a motion, there should be a second. And if you want, to do it a different way, I think I recollect back in the day, Chair Weil did it a little bit differently, given that these were just the minutes, approval of the minutes. So I know that's kind of a winded way of saying I don't have a preference as long as it's consistent.
Well, I remember Chair Weil had an extremely efficient way of doing it, but I don't remember exactly what he did.
Yeah, I don't remember either. So
I'm completely open to suggestions, and I completely agree. Let's do it one way and not switch around. So if anyone has a more expeditious way to do this, I'm very open to hearing that. Not even Commissioner Petrillo is offering.
Oh, it's not. Minutes are not typically a motion that would be. It's not a primary motion that's going to be discussed and action taken on. It's, it's I think what it was is that if the minutes, presiding officer can say the minutes have been read, are there any corrections? If no corrections are offered, then the presiding officer can say if there are no corrections, then the minutes are approved as read and distributed. And I think that's kind of how Chair Weil probably went about it. And that is acceptable within Robert's rules rather than having to take each one. And even with corrections, you can, a person can offer corrections and you can still say if there are no objections to further corrections, the minutes are approved as distributed and corrected. And then of course someone can raise an objection, right? So, but I've never seen that happen. So, I think you could do that, or you could do it a very, procedurally centric way of going through it with motion and a second each time. It seems a bit laborious.
Well, I agree. It does seem laborious. So let's practice on our third set and get our language settled. Are there any corrections for the minutes of March 30th, 2022? All right, I'm seeing none. If there are no objections, the minutes for March 30th, 2022 are accepted as submitted. Seeing none. No, I didn't do it right, Jeff?
No, you did.
Right.
No, you did. I was going to say that's perfect. Yeah. Minutes are approved as distributed and accepted.
Right. Seeing no objections, the minutes are approved as distributed and accepted.
Yeah. I always found it good just to have I'm going
to write it down.
A card in front of me.
Right.
Because by the end of the meeting, my brain is gone.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you all for that assistance. Our next item is Planning Commission communications. Does any commissioner have something they'd like to share with the commission? Okay, Commissioner, I see two hands. I think Commissioner Petrillo was first and then Commissioner Will.
Yeah, sorry, always taking an opportunity to talk. I wanted to thank staff for bringing in Andre Tremblay. And I realized we spent 90 minutes on it. But I wanted to let people know that, I work in this affordable house. When people tell me, let's do let's work on a manufactured housing as affordable housing. I was biased against it. I just didn't. I had the stigma was, as part of my just background, and I'm like legal and in terms of real estate, I was professionally biased. I was like, it's not real estate; it's personal property. How are we going to secure it? There is a way to secure it, but as a lender, but. So the 90 minutes is long, but it was worthwhile, I think, as Chair Lockwood said, which is the point I wanted to make, is that the more education about manufactured housing, the more that the perception of it will change or improve as it evolves. So I appreciate staff and my colleagues' patience with it, and at least giving Ms. Tremblay an opportunity to share all of that expertise.
Commissioner Will.
Yeah, I'm not. It's my first year on the commission, and so I'm not sure if we meet in July. I just wanted to let everybody know I'm not going to be able to attend any July commission meetings. So,
good point, Commissioner Will. I forgot all about that. I am out of the country the month of June, and if we meet, and I will attempt to dial in. I've done it before from overseas in this modern day of technology and communication. It's a interesting break from phoning in from another country to say, oh, hey, I'll listen in. So, or in this case, Zoom in. Is there any indication when the board or the county is going to revert to in-person meetings? So, I mean, it's up to the commissioners to decide, to dictate to us how they want to have it happen. I understand statutorily, I guess you're saying, if jurisdictions want to continue Zoom to expand public participation, that's great. But they could also elect to, would it be both? We would have hybrid meetings? Oh, okay. Thank you for the clarification.
I would add, don't jinx it. I think we're going to have it.
So July, we may meet in person, or some of us.
Not me. I'll see you in August, guys.
That is correct. We right now we have meetings planned for July 6th and July 20th.
And right, just following on that, we don't have like a regular recess. Actually, during ordinance season, when we had that, July was one of our busiest times. So luckily, we don't have that anymore. The only ordinance that I anticipate right now coming forward, and we're not sure on the timing yet, is the land divisions for middle housing under Senate Bill 458. We're going to start refining our draft on that once we get the bulk of the community development code changes engrossed with the board. So that may come in July, but we just don't know yet exactly the timing.
Well, I'm wondering about our next meeting, May 18th, and whether we'd like to leave that open or go ahead and cancel it now. Any comments on that? I think the indication from staff is that they don't anticipate having material for us on the 18th.
That's correct.
Yeah. Commissioner Will.
Would this be something we would move then as a commissioner to cancel it?
Yes.
So I would like to move that we cancel our planning commission meeting, the second meeting of May, which would be the 18th, 2022.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Vice Chair Dye, for the second. It's been moved and seconded that we cancel our second May meeting, which is May 18th. Any objection? Seeing none, the May 18th meeting is canceled.
Have a great trip, Jeff. Talk to you later.
Thank you. Yeah, that's right. We'll see you in August. The rest of you will buy. Or maybe I'll dial in. So I'll have email.
Any further commissioner communications? So our next item is adjournment. And now I'm having worries about language. What do I say?
Well,
say to them?
Go ahead, Commissioner Petrillo.
I was just going to say that you don't need a second to adjourn. The chair, it's a prerogative to say, is there any objection? If there's no objection, I declare this meeting adjourned.
Yeah, that's what I have been saying. So I'll continue saying that. If there's no objection, this afternoon's meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, everyone.
Seeing none, we are adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.